Chapter 1. Whispers in the Snow. The wind howled through the valley as Clara Bennett tightened her scarf around her neck. Snowflakes clung to her coat, their icy kisses brushing against her cheeks as she stepped out of her car. The small town of Winter Hollow lay before her, its streets bathed in the golden glow of old-fashioned lanterns, casting elongated shadows upon the pristine white snow. It was picturesque, almost frozen in time. But beneath its charming exterior, Clara knew, lay a mystery waiting to be unraveled. She had read about the town before, whispers of an unsolved disappearance that had haunted its history for decades. A woman named Eleanor Whitmore had vanished without a trace on Christmas Eve, her last known whereabouts the Grand Winter Hollow Christmas Ball, a mystery that had never been solved. And now, standing at the threshold of this seemingly enchanted town, Clara felt the weight of history pressing down on her. Adjusting the strap of her bag, she made her way through the town square, where twinkling fairy lights adorned every window and garland-draped storefronts exuded warmth despite the bitter cold. The air smelled of cinnamon, pine, and something else, a distant trace of nostalgia, as if the very town was whispering its past through the scent of the season. She had booked a room at the Whitmore Inn, a historic establishment that had once belonged to the very family at the heart of the mystery. As she approached, she could see the silhouette of the grand building standing against the darkening sky. Its Victorian architecture loomed over her, its frost-covered windows hiding whatever secrets lay within. A warm light flickered in the lobby, promising shelter, yet there was something unspoken in the stillness of the place that made her hesitate for just a moment. Pushing past her thoughts, Clara entered. The moment she stepped inside, she was met with the rich scent of aged wood and a crackling fire. The inn's interior was just as she had imagined, worn but beautiful, with elegant furnishings that told a story of grandeur long past. At the front desk stood a man, his tall frame partially obscured by the shadows cast by the fireplace. "Miss Bennett, I presume?" His voice was deep, steady, with a hint of something Clara couldn't quite place. When he stepped into the light, she took in his features, dark hair, storm-gray eyes, and a guarded expression that made it clear he was not one for idle conversation. "Yes, and you must be Nathaniel Gray," she replied, her voice steady despite the unease creeping along her spine. She had read about him too, owner of the Whitmore Inn, reclusive, with a reputation for keeping to himself. He nodded once before turning to retrieve a key from the wall. "Your room is ready. Top floor, third door on the left." Clara took the key from his outstretched hand, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. A strange chill ran through her, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else entirely. "Thank you." Nathaniel hesitated, as if weighing whether to say something more. Then, after a pause, he simply inclined his head. "If you need anything, let me know." With that, he turned and disappeared down a dimly lit corridor, leaving Clara standing alone in the silent lobby. She exhaled, feeling the weight of her purpose settle in her chest. She wasn't here for idle curiosity. She was here for answers. The story of Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance had been buried in time, but the truth had to be here, somewhere within the snow-covered walls of Winter Hollow. And as she ascended the stairs to her room, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was already part of the story unfolding once more. Outside, the wind carried the whispers of the past, weaving them into the falling snow. Chapter 2. The Letter Without a Name. The morning air in Winter Hollow was crisp, tinged with the scent of burning wood from distant chimneys. Clara woke to the sound of silence, a quiet so absolute it felt like the town itself was still asleep beneath its thick blanket of snow. She stretched beneath the warmth of the heavy quilt before pushing herself out of bed, shivering as her feet met the cold wooden floor. Pulling her thick woolen sweater over her head, she crossed the room to the window. Outside, The streets were nearly empty, save for a few early risers brushing snow off their porches. The town looked even more mysterious in daylight, quaint and charming, yet holding secrets in its every shadow. Her breath fogged up the glass as she exhaled, her mind drifting back to the night before. Nathaniel Gray. The way his eyes held hers for just a second too long. The way his voice carried weight, as if he held the key to a door he refused to open. Clara shook her head. She wasn't here to become entangled in the enigmatic innkeeper's personal mysteries. She was here for the truth about Eleanor Whitmore. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She hesitated before opening it, finding a neatly wrapped envelope lying on the floor just outside her room. There was no name, no indication of who had left it. Clara bent down, picking up the envelope and running her fingers along its edges before stepping back inside and closing the door behind her. Her heart pounded as she unsealed it. The parchment inside was old, the ink slightly faded. With careful hands, she unfolded the letter and began to read. Dearest, I fear time is slipping through my fingers faster than the snow melts beneath the first touch of spring. What we have, what we are, can never be spoken aloud, and yet, I find myself unable to keep these words inside any longer. If you find this, know that my heart was never my own to give, and yet, it has always belonged to you. E.W. Clara's breath caught. E.W. Eleanor Whitmore. Her fingers trembled as she traced the initials at the bottom of the letter. This was more than just a lost love note. This was a fragment of history, a whisper from the past that had found its way to her doorstep. But how? And why now, after all these years? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her spine stiffen. She rushed to the door, yanking it open, but the corridor was empty. Whoever had left the letter had vanished into the silence. Clara stepped back, heart racing. She needed answers, and the only person who might have them was the man who seemed to know more than he let on. Nathaniel Gray. Grabbing her coat, she pulled it tightly around her shoulders and left her room. The truth was waiting to be uncovered, and she had no intention of letting it slip through her fingers like melting snow. Chapter 3. A Stranger's Gaze. Clara stepped carefully through the thick snow, her boots sinking slightly with each step as she made her way across the town square. The morning light glowed faintly behind a veil of clouds, casting a soft, muted glow over Winter Hollow. The letter she had found weighed heavily in her coat pocket, its words echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. Her destination was clear, the Whitmore study. If there were any records, old letters, or even town archives hidden somewhere in this place, they would be there. And if Nathaniel Gray was truly as well versed in the inn's history as he seemed, he would have to give her something, whether he wanted to or not. As she reached the inn, she hesitated before pushing the heavy oak door open. The warmth from the crackling fireplace greeted her instantly, a stark contrast to the chill that still clung to her skin. The lobby was empty, save for a lone figure standing by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape beyond. Nathaniel. Clara studied him for a moment, taking in his rigid posture, the way his hands were tucked into the pockets of his dark wool coat. He looked lost in thought, as though he too was listening to the echoes of the past. She cleared her throat softly. Mr. Gray. He turned slowly, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, his gaze flickered to the envelope in her hand. You found it, he murmured. It wasn't a question. Clara's grip on the letter tightened. Yes, and I have questions. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair before nodding toward the study. Come with me. She followed him down a dimly lit hallway lined with portraits of the Whitmore family, their painted eyes seeming to watch her as she passed. The study was just as she imagined. Walls lined with towering bookshelves, a large wooden desk at the center, and a single flickering candle casting long shadows across the room. Nathaniel gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, clutching the letter. How did it end up at my door? His expression darkened. I don't know. Clara's lips pressed together in frustration. You must have some idea. Someone left it for me, and I don't believe in coincidences. Nathaniel leaned against the desk, his gaze never leaving hers. Neither do I. The air between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, he sighed and crossed the room to one of the bookshelves. He ran his fingers along the spines before pulling out an old leather-bound journal. He hesitated, then handed it to her. This belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, he said quietly. If you want answers, start here. Clara's pulse quickened as she took the book, feeling the worn leather beneath her fingertips. She slowly opened it, revealing the delicate script inside. A single sentence on the first page sent a shiver down her spine. If you are reading this, then my secret has not been buried beneath the snow. Her breath hitched. The mystery was only beginning, and she was standing at its heart. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Christmas Past. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Evermere, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant melody of carolers wrapped in scarves and mittens. Snowflakes danced in the golden glow of lanterns, their delicate descent casting a hushed reverence over the town. It was the kind of evening that made secrets linger in the air, waiting to be discovered, hiding in the folds of the night like whispered confessions. Isla hurried along the cobblestone path leading to the town square, her boots crunching against the freshly fallen snow. Her fingers tightened around the edges of her coat, the wool not nearly enough to shield her from the biting cold, but she welcomed the chill. It kept her thoughts sharp. Ever since she arrived in Evermere, a gnawing unease had settled within her, an inexplicable feeling that she was being watched. At first, she had dismissed it as her mind playing tricks, the natural paranoia of a stranger in an unfamiliar place. But now, she wasn't so sure. She stopped beneath the great clock tower, its iron hands frozen in time for the briefest second before ticking forward. The square was nearly deserted, save for a few late-night shoppers and the lingering aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Isla exhaled, a cloud of mist curling in the frigid air, and turned her attention to the notice board affixed to the side of the clock tower. There, among the usual town announcements and holiday events, was a single piece of parchment that hadn't been there before. The ink was bold, hurried, almost as if written in a rush. Do not trust the snow when it falls silently. A shiver crawled down her spine. Isla's eyes darted around the square, her pulse quickening. The note's presence, its warning. What did it mean? Was it simply a prank? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath its cryptic words? The town had always been painted as a picturesque haven, but Isla had learned long ago that beauty often concealed the most dangerous of truths. A noise behind her made her spin around, heart hammering. The only movement came from the wind picking up loose snow and sending it swirling into the air. And yet, the sensation of being watched lingered. Determined to shake off her unease, Isla pulled the note from the board and tucked it into her pocket. She told herself she was merely curious, that the warning meant nothing, but deep down, something told her this was only the beginning. As she turned to leave, the bells from the distant chapel rang through the night, a solemn sound that echoed in her bones. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes remained fixed on her retreating form, and the silent snow continued to fall, concealing all that lay beneath. Chapter 5. The Man in the Shadows. The hush of the winter night was deceiving. Evermere lay under a thick blanket of snow, its rooftops crowned in white, its cobblestone streets softened by nature's quiet hand. But despite the town's picturesque beauty, Isla could not shake the creeping sense of unease that had settled in her chest since she had found the warning note beneath the clock tower. She pressed a gloved hand against the note in her pocket as she walked, its edges crisp against her fingertips. "Do not trust the snow when it falls silently." The words replayed in her mind, an ominous refrain that refused to let her be. Had someone meant it as a riddle? A joke? Or was there a deeper, more sinister meaning behind it? The wind carried the distant sound of chimes, their melody unsettling in the cold darkness. Isla's boots crunched against the icy ground as she made her way toward the edge of town, where the old bookstore stood, its warm glow flickering through frost-covered windows. It was one of the few places in Evermere that still felt safe to her, a haven of worn pages and whispered histories. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small bell jingled, announcing her arrival. The scent of parchment and aged leather wrapped around her like an old friend. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper, Mr. Alden, looked up from his reading, his round spectacles slipping slightly down his nose. "Ah, Miss Isla," he greeted, voice lined with warmth. "Braving the cold this late?" "I needed a distraction," she admitted, pulling off her gloves. "And maybe a mystery novel to take my mind off things." Mr. Alden chuckled, adjusting his spectacles. "Evermere has mysteries enough of its own, wouldn't you say?" Isla hesitated, watching his expression for any sign that he knew something, anything, about the note she had found. But his face remained unreadable, his hands carefully flipping the page of his book as though he had all the time in the world. Before she could respond, the door behind her creaked open, sending a gust of icy air into the cozy shop. Isla turned instinctively, her pulse quickening. A man stood in the doorway, tall and wrapped in a dark coat dusted with snow. His gaze met hers for a fraction of a second before sweeping over the shop's dimly lit shelves. There was something unsettling about him, something that sent a chill running deeper than the cold wind outside. Mr. Alden cleared his throat. "Can I help you, sir?" The man's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. "Just looking." Isla forced herself to turn back toward the shelves, but she couldn't ignore the prickle at the back of her neck. Something about this night felt different, off-kilter, and as the stranger moved deeper into the store, the sensation of being watched returned with an intensity that made her breath hitch. She might have dismissed it as paranoia, had it not been for the way the note in her pocket seemed to grow heavier, as though it carried more than mere ink upon its paper. The snow outside continued to fall, silent and unassuming. But Isla knew now, some silences were meant to be broken. Chapter 6: Footprints That Vanish. The snowfall had thickened overnight, coating the town of Evermere in an untouched, pristine white. The world outside Isla's window looked deceptively peaceful, as though it had been frozen in time. But despite the beauty of the morning, the unease that had followed her since finding the note the previous evening clung to her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't escape. She sat at the small oak desk in her rented cottage, staring at the parchment she had pulled from the town's notice board. "Do not trust the snow when it falls silently." The words haunted her, their meaning elusive yet pressing. Who had left the message? And what exactly were they trying to warn against? With a sigh, she pulled on a thick woolen coat and laced her boots. She couldn't let paranoia dictate her actions. If she was going to find answers, she had to face whatever was lurking beneath the surface of Evermere's quaint charm. The town square was quieter than usual, muffled by the heavy snowfall. A few townsfolk moved about, their voices hushed as though they, too, felt the weight of something unseen. Isla's eyes darted to the notice board, half expecting another cryptic note to have appeared overnight. But there was nothing. Looking for something? The deep voice startled her, and she turned sharply to see the man from the bookstore standing a few feet away. His dark coat was dusted with snow, and his piercing gaze held hers, unreadable. Isla hesitated. Just checking for new notices. He nodded slowly, studying her. Strange thing about the snow, isn't it? Her breath hitched slightly. What do you mean? The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. The silence. It's never truly silent in Evermere. Not when the snow falls. A chill ran down her spine, and she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or his words. Do you know who left the note? A muscle in his jaw twitched, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, finally, he said, maybe. Or maybe I just know that warnings don't appear without reason. Before she could press him further, he turned and disappeared into the veil of falling snow, his footsteps vanishing almost instantly. Isla's heart pounded as she watched him go, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. She exhaled sharply and turned in the opposite direction. If there were answers to be found, they wouldn't come from standing in the cold. She needed to dig deeper, to uncover the truth buried beneath Evermere's secrets. And she had the unsettling feeling that she was running out of time. Chapter 7. A Heartbound Mystery. The snowfall thickened as Isla made her way down the winding path leading toward the outskirts of Evermere. The cold seeped through her gloves, biting at her fingertips, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too consumed with the stranger's words, the lingering warning that seemed to tighten around her chest like an invisible hand. The silence. It's never truly silent in Evermere. Not when the snow falls. The words echoed in her mind, twisting into 1,000 unspoken fears. The town had always felt different, its quiet streets and old-world charm masking something just beneath the surface. And now, as the winter storm began to stir, Isla could no longer ignore the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. She had decided to follow the stranger, but he had vanished into the white haze of the snow before she could even attempt to track him. That left her with only one option, searching for answers on her own. Her boots crunched over the frozen ground as she approached the edge of the forest, where towering pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with fresh snow. The air felt heavier here, charged with something unspoken. A single lantern flickered in the distance. A small cabin nestled between the trees, its windows aglow with amber light. Taking a steadying breath, Isla stepped forward, her pulse quickening. She knocked once, twice, before the door creaked open to reveal an older woman wrapped in layers of wool, her sharp eyes scrutinizing Isla from beneath a fur-lined hood. "You shouldn't be out here," the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Not with the storm coming." "I need to ask you something," Isla said, ignoring the cold sting of the wind against her face. "About the snow. About Evermere." The woman's gaze darkened, but she stepped aside, allowing Isla inside. The warmth of the cabin was immediate, the scent of burning wood filling the small space. A kettle whistled softly over the fire, and a single chair sat beside the hearth, a thick woolen blanket draped over it. The woman gestured for Isla to sit, then poured them both a cup of tea. "You seek the truth," she murmured, watching as Isla wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "But some truths are buried for a reason." Isla met her gaze, refusing to look away. "Someone left a note," she said. "A warning. I need to know what it means." The woman inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the edge of her cup. "Then you've already stepped too far into the storm." A shiver ran down Isla's spine, but she held her ground. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. And deep in the distance, beyond the safety of the cabin walls, something moved in the storm. Something watching, waiting. Chapter 8. Moonlight and Secrets. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hushed silence that blanketed the town. The air was crisp, fresh, with the promise of a new beginning, yet a lingering sense of uncertainty still hung over Amelia's heart. The storm had done more than shake the foundations of the town. It had cracked the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. There was something undeniably magnetic about her encounters with Ethan, something that both terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. As the snow began to settle, Amelia ventured out of her apartment, the weight of the morning's thoughts heavy on her shoulders. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, letting the cool air fill her lungs. It wasn't just the weather that was cold, but the quiet tension in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the kiss, or how effortlessly they had connected. Ethan's touch had been gentle, like the delicate falling snowflakes that had surrounded them in that moment. But there was something more, something in his eyes that she couldn't place. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts that crowded her mind. "You're overthinking it," she told herself. It was just a kiss, a moment. But as she wandered through the snow-dusted streets of the town, she couldn't help but notice the absence of anything normal. Everything felt surreal. The holiday decorations that lined the streets, the laughter from the nearby cafe, the soft glow of street lamps against the snow. None of it seemed to match the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. It was like the world was out of sync with her own heartbeat. Her footsteps crunched against the thick layer of snow as she made her way to the small, independent bookstore she frequented. There was something comforting about the familiar space, the scent of old paper and leather binding, the quiet hum of solitude that enveloped her. She had been there often enough to know the routine, but today, everything felt different. As she pushed open the door, a bell chimed above her, announcing her arrival. Amelia, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Whitaker, called from behind the counter. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a warmth that radiated from her presence. "What brings you in today?" "I needed some time away from everything," Amelia replied softly, a half-smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Mrs. Whitaker nodded knowingly. "I see. Well, the world is always a bit quieter in here. Take your time." Amelia wandered the aisles, her fingers grazing the spines of the books as if they might offer some answers. She'd always found solace in the pages of novels, in the lives of characters who knew what it was like to struggle, to love, to lose. But today, the words seemed distant, like they were just out of reach, like the world of fiction could never compare to the strange, confusing reality of her own. Her mind wandered back to Ethan again. She couldn't help it. The kiss hadn't been anything particularly extraordinary, but the connection, it was undeniable. There was something raw about the way he looked at her, like he could see right through the walls she had spent so long building. And yet, he was the one who seemed to hold back, as though he was fighting his own battles, his own secrets. She turned a corner, her thoughts clouding her vision, and collided with someone. A solid, warm presence that sent a ripple of electricity through her. She looked up, startled, and found herself staring into the familiar gaze of Ethan. "Sorry," he said quickly, his voice low and laced with an apology. "I didn't see you there." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The moment stretched between them, and for a heartbeat, the world around them seemed to stop. The only sound was the soft crackling of the heater in the corner and the steady rhythm of her own pulse in her ears. Ethan took a step back, clearly just as startled by the encounter as she was. His hands were stuffed in his coat pockets, and there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's fine," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them felt charged, like static electricity hanging in the air, waiting for something to spark. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, and Amelia took the opportunity to gather her thoughts. She couldn't keep letting this strange attraction pull her in. She had to remain grounded. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was a little steadier now, though her heart still raced in her chest. Ethan gave her a small, almost hesitant smile. "I needed a distraction, I suppose." Thought I'd find it in books, but," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the shelves around them. "It's not working as well as I hoped." Amelia nodded, her fingers idly tracing the edge of a book on the shelf beside her. "Books are like that sometimes. They help, but they don't always have the answers we need." He glanced at her, a knowing expression crossing his face. "True. I think sometimes we need someone to talk to, not just a story." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should have been. Ethan's voice had softened, a vulnerability in it that she hadn't expected. She met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat at the sincerity in his eyes. "What's on your mind?" she asked before she could stop herself, her voice quiet, unsure. Ethan paused, his gaze falling to the floor for a brief moment as if gathering his thoughts. "There's a lot, actually," he said slowly, as though considering whether or not to continue. "But I don't know how much of it I can share." Amelia swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She didn't want to push him, but the pull between them was undeniable. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said softly, "but I'm here if you want to." For a moment, Ethan looked as though he might say something, but then he exhaled deeply, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think maybe I just needed to hear that." Amelia smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something she hadn't expected to feel today. "Well," she said, stepping back a little to give him space, "I think I should let you have your space here. I need to get going anyway." Ethan nodded. "Of course. Take care, Amelia." "You too," she replied, her voice barely a whisper as she made her way toward the door. As she stepped back into the cold winter air, Amelia found that the chill didn't feel so biting anymore. For the first time in days, she felt as though there was a glimmer of hope, a spark that she hadn't been able to see before. And for the first time, she didn't feel so alone in this strange, snowy town. As she walked down the street, the snowflakes began to fall again, soft and gentle. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't as afraid of what was to come. There was something about the quiet, peaceful snowfall that gave her a sense of calm. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to find peace here. If not with Ethan, then within herself. Chapter 9. A Dance with Ghosts. The days following the brief, almost fleeting encounter with Ethan felt like a strange blend of ordinary and extraordinary. Amelia had tried to return to her routine, burying herself in work and the tasks of the holiday season, but every passing hour seemed to echo with his words, his gaze, the subtle warmth she had felt in that quiet moment. It was impossible to ignore, like an unanswered question hanging in the air. The snow had continued to fall steadily, covering the town in a thick, shimmering layer that transformed every street corner, every tree, into something magical. It was the kind of winter that looked perfect from a distance, but upon closer inspection, it was cold, sharp, and unforgiving. Much like the emotions Amelia had been trying to navigate, she found herself wandering more often through the town streets, hoping to clear her mind, to regain the sense of calm she had felt that morning in the bookstore. But there was always something pulling her back to thoughts of Ethan, like an invisible thread tying them together, pulling her ever closer even when she tried to distance herself. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the connection between them was undeniable, even if they hadn't fully acknowledged it. There was something there, a quiet understanding, a shared loneliness that neither of them could shake. On a particularly crisp evening, with the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the snow falling gently around her, Amelia found herself at the edge of the town square. She hadn't planned to come here, but the sights of the Christmas market, rows of wooden stalls adorned with twinkling lights, and the scent of mulled wine and cinnamon, pulled her in like a magnet. She walked slowly, letting the festive atmosphere wash over her, but her mind kept drifting back to the same question. What is it about him? She stood by a stall selling handmade ornaments, staring at the intricate glass snowflakes hanging from delicate strings. She reached out to touch one, her fingers grazing the cool surface. The sensation was oddly soothing, the smoothness of the glass somehow calming the storm in her chest. But as she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Amelia. Her heart skipped a beat at the sound of Ethan's voice, so unexpected yet welcome. She turned to face him, surprised to see him standing there, his coat zipped up against the cold, his hands tucked into his pockets. Ethan, she said, her voice a little more tentative than she'd intended. She wasn't sure what to expect, whether this encounter would be awkward or natural, but it was already unfolding before her, and she felt oddly grateful for the moment. He smiled, though there was a hint of something in his eyes that she couldn't place. I didn't expect to run into you here. Amelia shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. I didn't expect to be here either. I guess the market called to me. Same here, Ethan said, his voice tinged with a quiet humor. There's something about the chaos of Christmas that feels comforting, even if it's all a bit much. Amelia chuckled softly, the tension in her shoulders loosening just a bit. I know what you mean. It's like the world is spinning in 1,000 directions, but for some reason, it feels like it's supposed to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They both simply stood there, watching the market bustle with life, the laughter of children playing in the snow, the chatter of people buying gifts, the sound of Christmas music filling the air. The world around them was alive with joy, but in this small corner of it, there was only silence between them, filled with a quiet understanding. Ethan shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. I've been thinking about you, about what you said the other day. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to bring it up. The brief exchange in the bookstore felt so distant now, like a memory she hadn't fully processed. What did I say? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. You said you were here if I wanted to talk. About anything? Amelia swallowed, the words suddenly feeling heavier than she remembered. She hadn't expected him to take her up on that offer, not like this, in the middle of the bustling market. But here he was, standing before her, his expression earnest, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. You don't have to share anything you're not ready to, she said softly, feeling the weight of his unspoken thoughts pressing against her chest. But if you want to talk, I'll listen. For a long time, Ethan didn't speak, his eyes searching hers, as if he was weighing something deep inside. The flickering lights from the nearby stalls cast shadows across his face, making him look distant, almost haunted. But then, he exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing, and he nodded. I don't know how to explain it, he said quietly, but it feels like I'm stuck. In this loop, this place where I'm not really moving forward, but not looking back either. Like I'm suspended in time. Amelia's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. She understood that feeling all too well, the sense of being adrift, of being caught between two worlds, unsure of how to break free. She took a small step closer to him, not out of obligation, but because the pull between them seemed to draw her in. I know what that's like, she said, her voice steady, but her own emotions threatening to break through. It's like being frozen, stuck in one place while the world keeps moving around you. Ethan looked at her, his expression softening, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability in him clearly. The same uncertainty that had been eating away at her, the same hesitation. He reached out, as if without thinking, and placed his hand gently on her arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a warmth rushing through her, a sensation that felt like both a question and an answer. I don't want to be stuck anymore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not in this place, not in this life." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The words he had spoken weren't just a confession, they were a revelation, a plea for change, for something real, something that could pull him out of the loop he was caught in, and she knew, without a doubt, that she was a part of that change. She didn't know how or when, but she was ready to take that step with him. "I don't want to be stuck either," she replied, her voice low but resolute. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. The market, the snow, the laughter, all of it became distant as they stood there, locked in this fragile, tentative moment. Their connection had deepened, but they both knew that it was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, uncertainties, and fears. But for the first time, Amelia wasn't afraid. "I think," she began, taking a step closer, her voice more certain now, "that we're both ready to move forward. Together." Ethan's gaze softened, a flicker of hope crossing his features. "Together," he echoed, as if testing the word on his lips, allowing it to settle between them like a promise. And for the first time, Amelia believed it. The storm inside her heart was finally beginning to subside, and she knew that, in that quiet moment under the falling snow, something had changed. Something important. Something that would guide them both into the unknown future, step by uncertain step. Chapter 10. Between the Lines of Love. The days had grown colder, the nights longer, and with each passing moment, the quiet bond between Amelia and Ethan seemed to grow stronger, weaving itself into the fabric of their lives. It was strange how quickly everything had changed. One moment, they were two strangers sharing nothing but fleeting glances and unanswered questions, and now, they were something more. Neither of them had yet defined it, and perhaps they never would, but it didn't matter. The connection between them was there, undeniable and undeniable, even if it remained unspoken for the most part. Amelia found herself thinking about him more than she had anticipated. He lingered in the corners of her mind, his voice in her thoughts, his touch in her memories. But despite the closeness that was beginning to form, there were still gaps, unanswered questions, unspoken fears that neither of them had fully confronted. There were pieces of their pasts, hidden just out of reach, lingering like shadows, and neither seemed ready to bring them into the light. It was a Sunday afternoon when Ethan appeared outside her apartment, the same soft snow falling gently around him as he stood at the base of the stairs leading to her door. He had come, unannounced, but with a purpose that was clear in the way he looked at her. She had just returned from a walk through the town, wrapped in her scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Amelia," he said, his voice a little more hesitant than usual, but there was an earnestness in his gaze that stopped her in her tracks. "Can we talk?" She paused, unsure of what this conversation would be about. For all the comfort they had found in each other's presence, there was still so much they hadn't said aloud, so much that hovered between them like an unspoken agreement to keep their fears locked away. But she couldn't ignore the gravity of his tone, and after a beat of silence, she nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They moved to the living room, the soft hum of the heater the only sound filling the space between them. Ethan sat down first, a few inches away from where she stood, his posture tense, as though he was waiting for something, or someone, to pull the words out of him. "I don't know how to start this," he said quietly, his eyes focused on the floor before him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I feel like we've both been avoiding something we both know we need to confront." Amelia swallowed hard, her heart beginning to race. She had sensed the unspoken tension between them, the things they hadn't yet shared, the pieces of their past that they hadn't dared to unearth. She didn't know if she was ready to face those shadows, to walk into the parts of her life she had buried so deeply. But something in Ethan's voice told her that whatever this was, It couldn't be ignored any longer. "Go on," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan exhaled, his fingers running through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "There are things I haven't told you. Things from my past that, well, I've never really faced, if I'm being honest." He met her gaze, his eyes haunted, like the weight of what he was about to say was already too much for him to carry. "I'm afraid that if I do, it'll change everything between us." Amelia's heart twisted in her chest. She had known, deep down, that Ethan was carrying something with him. Something dark and heavy that he hadn't shared. Something that was keeping him tethered to the past. She had her own ghosts, too. Ghosts she hadn't yet revealed to him. But she could sense that whatever Ethan was about to say, it was the thing that had been holding him back from fully embracing the possibility of a future together. "I won't judge you," Amelia said softly, her voice steady, despite the fear that suddenly gripped her. "I promise." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife. She died a year ago." The words hung in the air between them, cold and unyielding, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, and the weight of his confession pressed down on her like a stone. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to carry something so raw, so painful with him. The realization hit her hard. Ethan hadn't just been running from his past. He had been running from a grief that was consuming him, a grief that had left him fractured and uncertain. "I'm so sorry," Amelia said softly, the words feeling inadequate in the face of such pain. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she didn't know how. The space between them suddenly felt vast, as if the walls of his past were keeping her at arm's length. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, a sound that held no humor. "I'm still trying to figure out how to move forward. I don't know how to let go of what I lost. I don't know if I ever will." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the emotion raw and jagged, like a wound that had never fully healed. "And I don't want to bring you into that, Amelia. I don't want you to feel like you have to carry my burden too." Amelia's heart ached for him, but she also felt something else, a flicker of recognition. She understood the pain he was feeling, because she, too, had buried parts of herself, parts of her own past that she hadn't been ready to face. Her grandmother's death, the loss of the one person who had truly understood her, had left a gaping hole in her heart, and she had spent the last year trying to ignore the emptiness that came with it. "I understand more than you know," Amelia said quietly, sitting down beside him, the distance between them shrinking just a little. "I lost someone too, my grandmother, and I've spent the last year trying to convince myself that I'm fine, that I don't need anyone, that I can handle it on my own." Ethan turned to her, his expression softer now, his eyes searching hers. "But it doesn't work like that, does it?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared grief settling around them like a heavy fog. But in that silence, something shifted between them. The walls they had both built, the barriers they had put up to protect themselves from the pain, were beginning to crumble. The truth, raw and vulnerable, was finally coming to light, and in that moment, they both realized that it was okay to not have all the answers, to not be okay all the time. "I don't have a solution," Amelia said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But I'm here, Ethan. I'm here, if you want me to be." He looked at her, his expression softening, and for the first time since their meeting, the weight in his eyes seemed to lighten, if only for a moment. "I want you to be here," he said softly. I think I need you to be." Amelia's heart fluttered in her chest at his words, but it wasn't a feeling of fear this time. It was a feeling of hope, a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for so long. They both had scars, both had lost, but they were still standing, still here, still fighting. And for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt like maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever came next, together. Chapter 11. Storm of the Heart. The days after their conversation, as raw and revealing as it had been, seemed to pass by in a blur. Amelia couldn't quite shake the weight of Ethan's confession, his pain, his vulnerability, but she also couldn't deny the way it had shifted something between them. The air around them had become charged, full of unspoken understanding, like they were two people standing on the edge of something both beautiful and terrifying. It was early December, and the town had embraced the holiday season with the usual charm. Twinkling lights lined every street, and the familiar hum of Christmas carols filled the air. People bustled about, eager to finish their shopping, while the town square stood as a winter wonderland, with its ice skating rink and festive booths selling hot cocoa and roasted chestnuts. But despite the cheer that surrounded her, Amelia felt a pull towards something deeper, something quieter. Ethan had been distant since their conversation, but it wasn't the kind of distance that made her feel rejected. It was a kind of silence that spoke volumes. A silence filled with questions neither of them knew how to ask, filled with emotions neither of them had fully processed. He had retreated into himself, not out of avoidance, but out of necessity, as though he needed time to make sense of everything they had shared. Amelia tried to focus on her work at the bookstore, but her mind kept drifting back to him. She missed his presence, his warmth, the way he seemed to understand the unspoken things between them. It was as if he had become a part of the rhythm of her life, and without him, the world felt just a little bit quieter. It was on one such afternoon, while she was shelving a new batch of books, when the bell above the door rang, signaling the arrival of a customer. She looked up, expecting to see the usual stream of regulars, townsfolk picking up their weekly reads or tourists searching for holiday gifts, but instead, her heart skipped a beat when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway. He looked different somehow. There was a weariness in his eyes, but it was tempered by something else, something softer, more open. His usual guarded demeanor had shifted, as though the walls around him were slowly coming down, piece by piece. "Amelia," he said, his voice low but steady. "Can we talk?" She felt a flicker of hope in her chest, and before she could think, she nodded, motioning toward the small table near the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the room, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to fade into the background as they sat across from one another. The silence between them wasn't heavy now, but gentle, like the space between old friends, or perhaps something more. "Of course," she said, her voice soft, trying to match the calm she felt in her heart. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hands resting on the table as he searched for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, as though he was weighing each syllable carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about," he began. "About my past, and about us." Amelia's pulse quickened. She had wondered when the next step would come, when they would finally face the future together, whatever that future might hold. But she didn't want to rush him, didn't want to make him feel like he had to say something before he was ready. Still, her heart was open to whatever he needed to share. "I've been carrying this weight for so long," Ethan continued, his gaze fixed on her, as if trying to gauge her reaction. "I thought if I could just bury it deep enough, it would stop affecting me. But it doesn't work like that, does it?" Amelia shook her head slowly. "No, it doesn't." He let out a long breath, as though releasing some of the tension that had built up in him. "I'm ready to let go of the things that are holding me back. I think I'm ready to move forward." Amelia's heart soared at his words. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when he would let go of the past and allow himself to embrace the possibility of a future with her. But there was still one thing that lingered in the back of her mind, something she had to ask, something that had been quietly eating away at her since their last conversation. "And what about us?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens when you move forward? Does that mean we move forward too?" Ethan's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought he might pull away, that he might retreat into the silence that had become so familiar between them. But instead, he reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. The simple touch sent a wave of warmth through her, and she felt the space between them shrink, the distance they had been circling slowly closing. "I don't know what happens," he said, his voice filled with both uncertainty and hope. "But I know that I don't want to let you go, Amelia. I don't want to lose whatever this is between us." Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was something more. A promise, an intention, a desire to move forward together despite the uncertainty of the road ahead. And for Amelia, that was enough. "I don't want to lose it either," she said, her voice steady now, her heart finally at ease. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you." They sat there in silence, their hands still intertwined, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The world outside had grown darker, but inside the small bookstore, there was a quiet warmth, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long time, Amelia felt like she wasn't alone. And for Ethan, the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift, if only for a moment, as if he could finally breathe again. "I think we're both ready," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Ready to take the next step?" Amelia nodded, her heart full. "I think we are." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together. No more hiding, no more running from the past. Just the two of them, standing side by side, ready to move forward into the unknown, their hearts entwined by the promises they had yet to speak, but both understood deeply. Chapter 12. A Kiss Stolen by Fate. The first snow of December fell like a veil, soft and gentle at first, but steadily growing heavier as the day wore on. By the time evening came, the town square had transformed into a frosty wonderland, where each street lamp cast long shadows on the thickening white blanket. The air was crisp, biting even, and Amelia couldn't help but smile as she looked out from the warmth of the bookstore window. The town had always felt magical during this time of year, but now, with Ethan by her side, it felt even more so. There was a quiet peace settling over her, a stillness that whispered of new beginnings. After their conversation the day before, Amelia had felt a sense of relief, of hope. The weight that had hung between them had finally lifted, and though they hadn't rushed into anything, they were both silently aware of the shift. There was a tenderness between them now, unspoken but clear. Ethan's quiet presence had become a comfort, his proximity something Amelia looked forward to every day. But just as the night sky held an ominous promise of more snow, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Amelia could feel it, like a storm gathering in the distance, something neither of them had yet named. Though they had found their way through the past, there were still parts of themselves and of each other that they hadn't fully uncovered. It was as though a quiet storm of doubt and hesitation brewed beneath the surface, threatening to stir the peace they had found. That evening, as Amelia closed up the shop, she noticed Ethan standing across the street, his figure outlined by the glow of the lamplights. He was waiting for her. She had been lost in thought, too caught up in the rhythm of the day to notice how late it had gotten. But now that the sky had darkened, it was clear she'd be meeting him in the middle of a snowstorm. She quickly grabbed her coat and scarf, locking the door behind her before making her way over. Ethan's gaze softened as she crossed the street toward him, and for a moment, they simply stood there, watching the snow fall in swirling flurries around them. "I wasn't sure if you'd be done yet," Ethan said, his voice low but warm. He offered her a soft smile, his hands tucked into his pockets against the cold. "I didn't expect to stay so late," she admitted, brushing the snow from her shoulders as she stepped closer. "It's kind of peaceful, though, isn't it? The snow, it makes everything feel quieter somehow." Ethan nodded, his eyes turning toward the falling snowflakes as if he was seeing something more than just the white powder accumulating on the streets. "It's beautiful, but it also makes me feel like I'm standing still, like everything around me is moving, but I'm just here, waiting." Amelia frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. Was he referring to the way their lives had been since they had started this tentative journey together? Had he been feeling the same pull of uncertainty that she had? The tension she had sensed earlier seemed to grow in that moment, filling the space between them with something unspoken. "Waiting for what?" she asked gently, her voice tentative. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes briefly meeting hers before looking away again, his gaze shifting back to the snow. "I don't know. I think I'm waiting for the moment when everything makes sense. When I stop feeling like I'm walking through fog." Amelia's heart clenched. She could understand that. She had felt it too, especially in the quiet moments when she found herself alone, searching for answers that didn't seem to come. She had thought that, by now, she would have figured out how to move forward. But the more she tried, the more she realized there were pieces missing from the puzzle. "It's okay to not have everything figured out," she said softly. "We don't have to know exactly where we're going." But Ethan was silent for a long time, as if her words hadn't quite reached him. Instead, he turned toward the direction of the small cafe they had visited a few days ago. "Do you want to go somewhere warm? I feel like I need to talk about everything." Amelia hesitated, unsure of whether this was the moment they needed to confront all that had been left unsaid. But something in Ethan's eyes, something vulnerable and searching, made her nod. "I think we both do." They walked together to the cafe, the silence between them no longer feeling like an uncomfortable void but like a quiet space where the answers were waiting, just out of reach. When they arrived, they found a corner table by the window, with a perfect view of the snow-covered street outside. The cafe was cozy, its walls lined with festive decorations, the faint smell of cinnamon and coffee filling the air. They sat across from each other, the warmth of the cafe in stark contrast to the cold air they had just left behind. Ethan ordered coffee for both of them, and for a moment, the bustle of the cafe seemed to quieten as they sat, just taking in the atmosphere. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter now, as though weighing every word. "About us." Amelia looked up at him, waiting. Her own thoughts were a whirlwind of uncertainty, of half-formed feelings that she hadn't been ready to share. But she knew this moment was necessary. They couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when they both had doubts lingering. "What about us?" she asked gently. Ethan shifted in his seat, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I don't want you to think I'm not ready for this," he said, his eyes meeting hers again, this time with a trace of determination. "But I've been carrying this weight for so long. It's hard to let go of the past, and sometimes I worry that I'll never be able to fully move forward." Amelia's heart skipped. She had suspected as much. Suspected that the reason he was holding back wasn't because of her, but because of the grief he still carried. She had seen how it clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake, and though she wanted to help him through it, she wasn't sure how. She had her own struggles, her own ghosts that she hadn't fully faced, and sometimes she felt like she wasn't equipped to heal him, to save him from the weight of his memories. "I understand," she whispered, her gaze steady. "I think we're both still healing, Ethan. And maybe it's okay that we're not ready for everything all at once. But we're here and we're trying." Ethan's lips twitched, a faint, but genuine smile breaking through the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Yeah," he said softly, "we are." They sat there in quiet understanding, the weight of their words lingering between them. The storm outside continued to rage, but in that moment, Amelia felt a calmness settle over her, as if they were finally starting to clear the fog that had kept them from seeing what was right in front of them all along. They didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but they were taking it together. And that, she realized, was enough for now. Chapter 13. The Name in the Snow. The following days passed in a haze of white, snow continuing to blanket the town in an endless, shimmering layer. Amelia had grown accustomed to the quiet that seemed to fill the spaces around her. It wasn't just the snow. It was the feeling that something new was beginning to take shape, something that she couldn't quite grasp, yet could feel stirring in her chest. It was as if her heart had learned to listen to the quiet moments, to the subtle things Ethan said, to the way his presence had become more than just comforting, but essential. Despite the quiet peace between them, there were moments when the uncertainty crept back in, like the snow that always managed to find its way into the warmest corners of her life. Ethan hadn't been entirely open about the things still weighing on him. He had made progress, yes, but there was something that still lingered behind his guarded expressions and the occasional silence. It was like there were words he wasn't saying, truths he hadn't yet shared. Amelia spent her days with the bookstore and the town's holiday festivities, trying to fill the space between her moments of doubt with something tangible, something concrete. But even the sparkle of the Christmas market, with its rows of twinkling lights and the rich scent of pine and cinnamon in the air, couldn't drown out the gnawing feeling that she and Ethan were standing at the edge of something, a precipice neither of them fully understood. She couldn't help but notice the way he seemed distant, just slightly, in the past few days. Not in a way that made her feel rejected, but more in a way that made her wonder what was happening beneath the surface. His smiles didn't reach his eyes as often, and when he spoke, there was a lingering hesitation in his voice, as if he were waiting for something. Waiting for her, maybe. Waiting for himself. It was that feeling of waiting that had started to unravel the calm she'd worked so hard to build. It had been there ever since their conversation at the cafe, when they had finally acknowledged the weight of their pasts. She knew they both needed time, but now, time seemed to be slipping away, and with it, the clarity they had once found. On a cold morning a few days before Christmas, Amelia found herself standing in front of the bookstore, brushing off the thin layer of snow that had accumulated on the windowsill. The town was quieter than usual, as though the holiday rush had temporarily paused, and people were retreating into their homes, preparing for the quiet of Christmas Eve. The air was still, save for the occasional flurry drifting down from the sky. As she turned back inside to continue with her work, the bell above the door rang, signaling the arrival of a customer. She turned, expecting the usual townsfolk, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway. He looked different, more troubled than usual. There was a weariness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, a shadow lingering in his gaze. He hesitated at the door, his hand gripping the handle for just a moment too long before he stepped inside. "Hey," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. "Hey," Amelia replied, her heart tightening in her chest. There was something in the way he said her name, something that felt off. She put down the book she'd been arranging and walked toward him. "Is everything okay?" Ethan met her eyes briefly before looking down at the floor, as though he were searching for the right words. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about what we talked about moving forward. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like I'm just not ready." The words hit her like a gust of cold wind. For a moment, Amelia could only stare at him, her mind racing. She had suspected this, but hearing him say it out loud made her feel as though the ground beneath her was shifting. She had tried to convince herself that they were both ready to face the future together, but now, the doubt that had been quietly growing inside her seemed to have taken shape. "I don't understand," she whispered, taking a step back. "I thought we were on the same page. I thought we both agreed that we wanted this." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "I do want this, Amelia. I really do. But I'm still caught up in everything. My past, my mistakes. I don't know how to let go of it all. I can't seem to break free of the things I've done, the things I've lost. I'm scared that no matter how hard I try, I'm just going to drag you down with me." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. He was fighting with himself, with his own fears and regrets, and she could feel it. Feel the weight of the unresolved feelings pressing down on him. Amelia wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that he didn't have to be afraid of moving forward, that she would be there to help him through it. But something inside her hesitated, a part of her afraid that his distance would become permanent, that the walls between them would grow higher than they had ever been before. "Ethan," she stopped herself, unsure of how to proceed. She didn't want to push him away, but the distance between them was beginning to feel like something insurmountable. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. "I need time, Amelia," he said softly. "I don't know how much time, but I need it. I need to figure this out before I can be what you deserve." Her heart clenched, a wave of sadness and understanding sweeping over her. She had known this moment might come, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. "I get it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to rush you, Ethan, but I need to know that you're here, that we're still moving forward together, even if it's slowly. I can't do this alone." He reached out to her, his hand trembling slightly as he gently took hers in his. "I don't want to lose you, Amelia. I'm just afraid that I'll hurt you, that I won't be able to be who you need me to be. I'm still broken in so many ways." Amelia felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back, refusing to let them fall. She understood his pain. She felt it too. But what she wanted more than anything was to move through it together, to face whatever came next as partners, not as two people standing on opposite sides of a wall. "You don't have to be perfect," she said softly. "I'm not perfect either. But we can figure this out, step by step. I just need to know that you're willing to try." There was a long pause, and in that moment, it felt like everything had come to a standstill. The snow outside continued to fall, the silence of the bookstore thick around them. And then, finally, Ethan nodded, his expression softening, though his eyes still held uncertainty. "I'll try," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try for us." Amelia smiled through her tears, the smallest flicker of hope stirring in her chest. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. They were both still unraveling, still finding their way, but maybe that was the only way to move forward. Slowly, carefully, and together. Chapter 14. When Truth Calls. The days following their conversation felt like a quiet stretch of road, each step forward slow but deliberate, and yet full of unseen tension. Amelia tried to take Ethan's words to heart, to believe that their journey together didn't have to be rushed. But the weight of unspoken things continued to settle between them, like snow piling up on an old bridge that hadn't been tended to in years. She could see it in the way Ethan sometimes withdrew, the way his gaze would wander off when she spoke, as if he were still far from where she was. There was an effort in his words, but sometimes it felt like he was holding back, still afraid of stepping too far into something he wasn't sure he could handle. As Christmas approached, the town seemed to take on a life of its own. Snow-dusted storefronts adorned with wreaths and garlands, the scent of fresh baked goods lingering in the air, and the hum of excitement from the families who filled the streets. But for all the warmth the town exuded, Amelia could feel a quiet shift in the atmosphere between her and Ethan. The moments of lightness they'd shared in the past few days felt more like memories than anything grounded in the present. The crackling fire in the cafe they visited once or twice, the smiles they exchanged when they wandered through the market, those small gestures of connection had slowly faded into an undercurrent of uncertainty. It wasn't that Ethan was distant, exactly. He still cared. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the brief touches he offered when their hands brushed. It was more that he was caught in a web of his own thoughts, his own past. And no matter how much she wished it, Amelia couldn't pull him out of it. She couldn't be the one to erase his pain. She couldn't fix him. One chilly afternoon, just days before Christmas Eve, she sat in the small corner of the bookstore, sorting through a box of old holiday cards she had come across during a recent inventory. Each card, though simple and worn, had its own story, its own quiet sentiment. She hadn't meant to go through them at all, but as she flipped through the pile, one card in particular caught her attention. It was a snow-covered scene, with an image of a tiny cottage lit from within, warm yellow light spilling out through the windows, and the text read, "No matter how cold the world may seem, love always finds a way to light up the dark." Amelia's heart clenched. She had been reading the same card for several minutes without realizing it, the words beginning to blur in her vision. She looked down at her hands, resting on the card's surface, and closed her eyes. Was she fooling herself? She had always believed in the magic of Christmas, in the idea of hope and new beginnings. But now, as she sat in the quiet of her shop, surrounded by the soft fall of snow outside and the ticking of the old clock on the wall, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something in her and Ethan's relationship hadn't fully clicked, and she wasn't sure what to do about it. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the doorbell ring when someone entered, and it wasn't until a voice cut through her musings that she looked up, startled. "You look deep in thought." Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes soft but searching. The faint traces of a smile pulled at his lips, but the exhaustion that seemed to follow him lingered just beneath the surface. His presence felt comforting, but there was a hesitation in the way he stood, like he wasn't quite sure how to step forward. It made Amelia's chest tighten. "I was just going through some of these cards," she said, offering him a small smile as she set the one in her hand aside. "It's funny how a little thing like a card can make you think about the bigger picture." Ethan walked over to her slowly, his gaze flicking from the cards to her face. "What's on your mind?" Amelia hesitated. She didn't want to press him too hard, especially not after everything they had been through. But something about the moment felt heavy, as though they both knew that neither of them was saying everything that needed to be said. "I've been wondering," she began, her voice quiet, "if we're really being honest with each other, or if we're just pretending that everything's fine." Ethan stiffened, and for a brief moment, his expression darkened. He took a step back, his hands folding into his pockets. "I don't know what you mean." Amelia's heart raced in her chest as she stood up from behind the counter, walking toward him with a sense of urgency. "Ethan, I see you. I see that you're still carrying something heavy. You say you're trying, and I want to believe that. But you're not letting me in. You're not letting me help you." His eyes softened then, though they still held a flicker of hesitation. "I don't know how to let go of it, Amelia. I don't know how to stop dragging my past with me. I'm afraid that if I open up completely, it'll hurt more than I can bear. And I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to ruin this. You deserve better." Her heart ached for him. She had seen it, the struggle beneath his every word, the way his emotions were locked behind a wall he had built long ago. It wasn't that he didn't want to open up. It was that he was terrified of what might happen if he did. "You don't have to protect me, Ethan," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking for you to be perfect. I'm not asking for you to fix yourself. I just want to be here for you. We don't have to have all the answers, but we can figure it out together. You're not alone in this." Ethan's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and for a moment, Amelia wondered if he was about to pull away again. But then, something shifted. Slowly, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His hand reached for hers, his touch tentative but warm. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I'm scared that if I let go of the past, I'll lose myself. And if I let you in, if I really let you in, I'm afraid I won't be enough for you. That I'll break you too." Amelia's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his voice, and for the first time in weeks, she stepped closer to him, wrapping her arms around him. She didn't know if he understood just how much she needed him to let her in, but she knew that, in this moment, all they needed was each other. "You're already enough," she whispered into his ear. "Just as you are. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here with me now. No more walls. No more distance." There was a long pause, and then Ethan let out a shaky breath, his arms wrapping around her in return. For a few moments, they stood there, letting the weight of the world slip away. In the soft quiet of the bookstore, with the snow gently falling outside, it felt as though they had finally taken the first step toward healing. But as the storm outside continued to rage, they both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The past would always be there, lingering beneath the surface. But maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. And that thought, however small, was enough to keep them moving forward. Chapter 15. A Love Worth Fighting For. The days leading up to Christmas Eve arrived with an air of hushed expectation, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Amelia found herself caught in the stillness, wrapped in a quiet tension that seemed to settle on the town like the snow that had kept falling relentlessly, soft and persistent, over the past week. It was the kind of snow that blanketed the world in a quiet cocoon, and for a time, everything felt suspended in the cold, crisp beauty of it all. But beneath the surface of that stillness, the threads between her and Ethan were beginning to weave themselves into something deeper. They had come to a place of understanding, albeit an uncertain one. The warmth of his touch lingered in her mind, and every time their eyes met, there was a flicker of something unspoken. Something fragile, yet undeniable. They were standing on the edge of something that neither of them could fully see, but both of them felt it, just beyond reach. Amelia had come to accept the space between them, not as a barrier but as a process, an unraveling of layers that would take time. She knew, in her heart, that it wasn't about rushing toward an end. It was about allowing the slow, steady unfolding of whatever it was that they had found together. Ethan wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but they were learning, slowly, how to fit together in a way that felt right. That evening, just a few days before Christmas Eve, Amelia found herself walking through the snow-covered streets of the town, her breath clouding in the chilly air as she made her way to the cafe that had become a place of refuge for them both. The lights of the Christmas market twinkled in the distance, the streets alive with holiday cheer, but there was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't shake. Something was coming. Something was about to shift. When she entered the cafe, the familiar warmth enveloped her, and the scent of coffee, cinnamon, and freshly baked goods filled her senses. She glanced around, expecting to see Ethan sitting at their usual spot by the window, but he wasn't there. She felt a pang of disappointment, though it was fleeting. She knew he had been grappling with his own demons, trying to find the courage to let go of the past that clung to him like an old, worn coat. But despite the space between them, she never stopped believing that they would find a way to work through it. She ordered a hot chocolate and sat at the small table by the window, her eyes scanning the soft, falling snow outside. The world felt so quiet here, so peaceful, as if time had slowed to match the stillness in her heart. It was the calm before something that she couldn't quite define. As she sipped her drink, her thoughts wandered back to the moments they had shared, the tender conversations, the quiet evenings where nothing needed to be said, just the presence of each other. And yet, despite all the progress they had made, there was a feeling that lingered in the pit of her stomach, something unresolved. She had always known that love wasn't perfect, that it didn't come with neat answers or easy resolutions. But she had never imagined it would be this complicated. The fear Ethan carried in his heart was real, and it made her want to reach out to him more than ever. She wanted to take away his pain, to show him that together they could face whatever ghosts haunted him. But how could she do that when he wasn't yet ready to face them himself? Her musings were interrupted by the soft jingle of the doorbell above the entrance. Amelia's gaze lifted instinctively, and her heart gave a small lurch when she saw Ethan standing there. He was holding a small package wrapped in red paper, and his eyes, though tired, held a soft determination. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She simply watched him, feeling the quiet understanding that passed between them like a shared secret. "Hey," he said softly, breaking the silence as he made his way to the table. "Hey," Amelia replied, a smile tugging at her lips despite the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Ethan set the small package down in front of her and sat across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was an intensity in his gaze, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. He wasn't hiding anymore, at least, not entirely. "What's this?" she asked, her fingers brushing over the smooth paper. "A Christmas gift," he said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything. And I know I've been holding back, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm trying, Amelia. I want to give us a chance." Her breath caught in her throat at his words. She hadn't expected this, not so soon. The weight of what he was offering, the trust he was extending, felt almost too much to bear. But she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest at the thought that he was finally opening himself up to her, letting her in ways he hadn't before. She unwrapped the package carefully, her heart pounding as the paper fell away to reveal a small, hand-carved wooden ornament. It was a delicate figure of a snowflake, its edges intricate and beautiful, its surface smooth under her fingers. But what took her breath away was the small engraving on the back. "For the one who brings warmth to the coldest days." Amelia's throat tightened, and her eyes pricked with tears as she looked up at Ethan. He was watching her with an expression that spoke volumes, of regret, of hope, of something more than she had ever expected. "I know it's not much," he said softly, "but it's a reminder that no matter how cold or dark things get, we can still find light in each other. You've shown me that, Amelia. You've shown me that I can still find hope." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Amelia was speechless. The weight of what he had just said, the vulnerability, the honesty, it was more than she could have imagined. And in that moment, she realized that she had been waiting for this. For him to see that he didn't have to carry his burdens alone. For him to believe that together, they could face whatever the future held. She placed the ornament gently on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. "Ethan, you don't have to be perfect. I never needed you to be. I just need you to be here, with me. And I'm here. I'm here for you." Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let out a small laugh, a sound that was genuine and free of the weight he had carried for so long. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly, but there was no bitterness in his voice, only acceptance. "You're wrong," Amelia whispered. "You deserve everything, and I'm glad you're here." He squeezed her hand gently, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm glad I'm here too." Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a small promise of the world that lay beyond this moment. And as the evening wore on, the cafe around them grew quieter, the soft glow of the Christmas lights casting a peaceful light over them. In that quiet space, beneath the weight of the past and the promise of the future, Amelia and Ethan found something neither of them had been able to find alone: a shared understanding, a glimmer of hope, and the beginnings of a love that could weather whatever storms lay ahead. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to carry them through the darkest nights. Chapter 16. The Final Clue. Christmas Eve arrived quietly, the snow falling in heavy drifts that covered the town in a blanket of white. The streets were lined with sparkling lights and wreaths, each shop adorned with festive decor, but the warmth of the holiday spirit felt distant in Amelia's heart. Though she had Ethan by her side now, the weight of everything unsaid still lingered between them like an uninvited guest. She stood at the window of her small bookstore, looking out at the swirling snowflakes, their edges delicate and fleeting. A part of her was still uncertain of how far they had truly come, uncertain of whether they could ever truly let go of the past. Yet another part of her held onto the quiet hope that, somehow, together they could create something new, something stronger than the weight of the history they carried. The evening had been calm so far. The town square had seen a few families milling around, enjoying the last-minute festivities before the night fully settled in. Amelia had stayed back, putting the finishing touches on a few small gifts she was planning to give her friends the next day. The silence in the bookstore felt peaceful, and yet her mind remained restless. She knew that Ethan was doing his best, but there was still something raw in his eyes, something unspoken that hung in the air whenever they were together. She had caught glimpses of it over the past week, of how he would occasionally slip into himself, retreating into some part of his past that he couldn't quite shake off. It was moments like those that made her feel small, like an outsider in the world he carried with him, and yet she never wanted to walk away. She wanted to be the one who could help him unravel those pieces, the one who could show him that he didn't need to face everything alone. A knock on the door broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Ethan standing there, the cold of the outside air brushing in with him as he stepped across the threshold. He looked tired, but there was a quiet resolve in the way he held himself. His coat was dusted with snow, his hair slightly tousled, but his eyes, those eyes that held so much, were softer than they had been in days. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice warm against the chill of the evening. "Hey," she replied, her heart giving a quiet flutter at the sight of him. He was always a welcome presence, a reminder of the connection they were beginning to forge despite all the unspoken things. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers as he reached out and gently touched her hand. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant but steady. "I know it's Christmas Eve, and I know we've come a long way, but I need to tell you something. Something I should have said a long time ago." Amelia felt her breath catch, her chest tightening at his words. "What is it?" Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around hers. "I'm not good at this. I'm not good at letting people in, at letting go of things. I've spent so long trying to hold on to everything, trying to fix things, that I didn't realize how much I've been holding on to the pain. I've been afraid that if I let it all out, if I let go, it might hurt too much." He paused, his gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "But the thing is, Amelia, I don't want to keep hiding from this anymore. From you. From what we have." Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For so long, she had wondered if he was truly ready to face everything he carried with him. She had seen the struggle in his eyes, felt the weight of his fear, but hearing him say it, hearing him admit that he was ready to let go of that fear, was a revelation. "I don't want to lose this," he whispered, his voice breaking with raw sincerity. "I don't want to lose you." Amelia swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overtake her as she squeezed his hand in return. "You won't lose me, Ethan. You don't have to do this alone. Whatever you're holding on to, whatever is still weighing on you, we'll face it together. You don't have to be afraid of losing me, because I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they stood there, their eyes locked in an unspoken understanding. The words they had shared hung in the air, heavy and tender, as if they had both finally broken through the wall they had built between them. But just as she felt a glimmer of hope, the storm outside seemed to intensify, the winds howling louder, the snow swirling more fiercely against the windows. It was as though nature itself was mirroring the quiet chaos they both felt within, the storm outside somehow echoing the unresolved feelings they carried within their hearts. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," Amelia said softly, her voice a whisper in the stillness. "But I do know this. I want to find out with you. Whatever happens, whatever comes, I want to face it together." Ethan's expression softened, the flicker of fear still present but overshadowed by something more. A recognition of the trust they were beginning to build between them. Slowly, he stepped closer, and without saying another word, he pulled her into his arms. The warmth of his embrace enveloped her like a shield, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of her own doubts and fears ease. In his arms, everything seemed a little more manageable. She could feel the tremble in his chest, the faint hint of his own anxiety, but it was tempered by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against hers. Outside, the storm raged on, the snow falling in thick, heavy sheets that turned the world into a blur of white. But inside, within the quiet sanctuary of the bookstore, there was peace. There was hope. "I'm not sure what to expect tonight," Ethan murmured into her hair. "But I know this. Being here with you in this moment is exactly where I'm meant to be." Amelia closed her eyes, a small, contented smile tugging at her lips. "I'm glad you're here. With me." The weight of everything they had been through, the distance, the pain, the uncertainty, didn't vanish in that moment. But in the softness of Ethan's embrace, Amelia knew that something had changed. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met, and they weren't perfect, but they were learning to trust, to heal, to be vulnerable. And that, she realized, was more than enough. The storm outside would eventually pass, and with it, the uncertainty that had plagued their hearts. The world would keep turning, the snow would melt, and Christmas would come. But in this moment, in the stillness of their shared space, the storm inside them was finally beginning to quiet, its ferocity slowly giving way to the quiet, steady warmth of a love that had been hidden but was now slowly, beautifully, beginning to shine. Chapter 17. A Christmas Promise. The morning after Christmas Eve broke slowly, as if the sky itself had been reluctant to let go of the stillness that had settled over the town. The streets were quiet, muffled beneath the fresh layer of snow that had fallen throughout the night. A pale light filtered through the snow-dusted trees and windows of the town, casting everything in a soft, dreamlike glow. It was a peaceful stillness, but beneath it, a subtle change had begun to stir. Amelia could feel it in the air, a promise of something new, something hopeful. She woke up to the scent of cinnamon and pine filling the air, the aroma wafting from the small kitchen where she had left a few candles burning the night before. Her heart swelled at the thought of Ethan, still asleep in the room they had shared last night, wrapped in a quiet sense of peace that seemed to come from the weight of the evening's words between them. There was a sense of closeness now, something that felt real and steady, something she hadn't dared to hope for, not even just a few weeks ago. As she lay there in the warmth of the blankets, her mind wandered back to the moment they had shared. Ethan had held her tightly, his words so raw and honest, a confession of vulnerability she had never expected. She had offered him her trust, and in return, He had given her a part of himself that she had always known he kept hidden. The storm of his past was still there, lingering like the quiet storm that had raged outside, but something in the way he had opened up to her had shifted. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs. Amelia smiled as she heard the familiar creak of the steps, followed by a gentle knock on the door. Ethan's voice drifted in, low and soft, yet filled with a tenderness that had become more frequent between them these days. "Amelia," he called quietly, "are you awake?" She pushed the blankets aside and stood, the warmth of the room contrasting sharply with the crisp cold outside. "I'm awake," she called back, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would break the fragile bubble of quiet that had formed around them. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room. His expression was different this morning. There was something lighter about him, as if the burden he had carried for so long was beginning to lift, piece by piece. His eyes found hers, and there was a vulnerability in them, but also something else, something more hopeful, more open. "Good morning," he said, his voice still groggy with sleep, but there was warmth in the way he said it, as if this simple greeting carried more meaning than just a daily ritual. "Good morning," Amelia replied, her heart giving a soft flutter. She noticed the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth, and it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this was the moment they had both been waiting for. The moment when they truly began to let go of their pasts, when they allowed themselves to step into the light of something new, something hopeful. Ethan walked further into the room, standing by the window where the light spilled through, casting soft shadows over the snow outside. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the world beyond, but his presence was steady, grounding. "Do you think things can change?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Amelia felt the weight of his question, and for a moment, she hesitated. But she knew, deep down, that this was the turning point. This was the moment when they both had to choose. Choose whether they would let the past continue to define them, or whether they would step forward together into the unknown. She crossed the room slowly, her feet light on the wooden floor, and stood next to him by the window. The world outside was still, the snowflakes falling in soft whispers, but Amelia could feel the tremor in the air, the quiet energy of change. "I think we're already changing," she said, her voice steady, her words carrying the truth she had come to realize. "I think we've already started to, Ethan. And it's not about the past anymore. It's about what we do with the future." Ethan turned to her then, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how to let go of everything that's holding me back." Amelia reached out, taking his hand gently in hers, offering him the same steady presence that he had given her. "I'm scared too," she said softly, "but I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to face it with you." For a long moment, they stood there, their hands entwined, their hearts beating in a quiet rhythm that spoke louder than any words ever could. The fear was still there, lingering in the corners of their minds, but it was no longer the thing that defined them. They had both let go of enough to realize that the future was theirs to shape, together. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. "Then let's face it. Let's face everything together." Amelia's heart soared at his words. She had always known that he was capable of more than he believed, more than the weight of his past would let him see. But in this moment, she saw it clearly. The man who had been so afraid of love, of opening himself to someone, was finally ready to do just that. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the need to carry the weight alone. They could face it all, together. The moment stretched between them, each breath deeper than the last, and in that stillness, Amelia realized something. The storm outside, the one that had raged in her heart for so long, was beginning to pass. It hadn't disappeared entirely, but the worst was over. The world was not a place of fear anymore. It was a place of possibility. With a quiet smile, Amelia took a step closer to him, her fingers brushing against his. "Let's make today the first day of the rest of our lives, Ethan." He smiled back, his hand squeezing hers gently. "I'm with you. Always." Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a symbol of the new beginning they were embracing. And though they both knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, they also knew that they had something now, something precious that no storm could take away. They had each other, and that, in the end, was all they truly needed. Chapter 18. The clock strikes midnight. The air was crisp as Amelia and Ethan stepped into the town square, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The town, still quiet from the holidays' festivities, felt peaceful, frozen in time, as if waiting for something to unfold. They walked side by side, their footsteps light on the fresh snow, the weight of the past few days lingering between them like a shared secret. Ethan's hand brushed against Amelia's, the touch small yet significant. He had been quieter than usual since the moment they had shared that morning. Something unreadable in his eyes, something that felt heavier than the unspoken promises they had made. She glanced at him, catching the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to be fixed on something far beyond the world they were walking through. "Ethan?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the stillness. He turned to her, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with something that resembled regret, but with a deep undertone of something more vulnerable. "I didn't mean to pull away. I've just been thinking about things I haven't said." Amelia's heart gave a small flutter. He had been quiet, but not in the way he had been before. The silence between them wasn't distant anymore. It was full of possibility, full of the kind of openness that came with trust. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something deeper, something unspoken. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any clue, any indication of what he was carrying inside. "Ethan, whatever it is, you don't have to keep it to yourself." "Not anymore." He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the small church at the edge of the square. "I need to tell you something. Something about my past. About what's been holding me back." The words hit Amelia like a sudden storm. She could feel the anxiety swirling between them, could see the conflict in his eyes. He had been so open with her recently, but this felt different. This was a part of him that had stayed hidden for too long, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the weight of it. "Okay," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to say it all at once, but I'm here. I'm listening." Ethan nodded slowly, his hands slipping into his pockets as he stared at the church. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for something painful. "I was married," he said, the words hanging in the air between them, fragile and heavy. "I don't talk about it much because it was complicated, and it ended badly. We were young, too young, I think, and I wasn't the man I should have been. It's not something I'm proud of." Amelia's heart twisted in her chest, but she remained still, waiting for him to continue. She had known there was more to his past, something that had shaped him into the man he was now, but hearing it from him was different. It made it real. His vulnerability, raw and open, felt like an invitation into a part of him that he had never shared with anyone. Not even her, not fully. "She left," he said quietly, his gaze shifting toward the ground. "She didn't just leave me, she left our whole life behind. There was a lot of anger, a lot of things that were never said, and I didn't handle it well. After that, I just couldn't bring myself to trust anyone. I couldn't open myself to anyone without carrying that fear, that sense of abandonment, with me?" Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, the weight of his confession heavier than anything Amelia had expected. She had seen him struggling, seen the wall he had built around himself, but she hadn't known it was so deeply rooted in his past. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, offering him the quiet support she knew he needed. "I didn't want you to think I was hiding it from you," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart ache. "I just didn't know how to tell you. I've never told anyone this, not even my closest friends. I didn't want to be that person who kept bringing up his past, his mistakes, and I was afraid it would scare you away. But I realized something this morning, Amelia. I can't keep running from it. I can't keep letting it define me. I don't want it to be the thing that stops us from moving forward." Amelia felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. She had always known that Ethan's silence came from somewhere deep, from something he had never fully healed from, but hearing the story behind it, it shattered the final pieces of the armor he had worn for so long. This was a raw, unhealed wound, and he was offering it to her, trusting her to see him, all of him, for the first time. "You don't have to be perfect, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to fix everything all at once. What matters is that you're here. You're with me, and I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers trembling as they brushed against her skin. It was the first time she had seen him truly vulnerable, truly raw, and yet in that moment, it was as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. His past, with all its pain and regret, was still there, but it didn't have to control him anymore. He took a deep breath, his shoulders loosening, and he smiled at her, softly, almost shyly, as if he wasn't used to the feeling of peace that was beginning to settle over him. "I don't know where this goes," he said, his voice quieter now, but filled with a new sense of resolve. "But I know I want to find out with you. Whatever happens, whatever comes next, I want to face it together. No more hiding, no more secrets." Amelia smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, still be filled with challenges and uncertainty. But standing there with Ethan, in that quiet moment, she realized that together, they could face whatever came their way. And as they turned to walk back toward the warmth of the bookstore, the weight of the past beginning to lift from their shoulders, Amelia felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The storm of their past had not gone unnoticed, but it no longer held them captive. They were free now, to move forward, to heal, and to build a future together. The snow continued to fall, softly and steadily, as if the world itself was offering its blessing on what was to come. Chapter 19. Unraveling the past, embracing the future. The days following their conversation had felt both like a beginning and an end. The air had shifted, and with it, so had Amelia and Ethan. There were still moments of quiet uncertainty between them, moments when the past seemed to creep in and linger, but the weight of those moments didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was as though the snow that continued to blanket the town had covered not just the streets, but also the old wounds they both carried. Amelia had noticed the change in Ethan most of all. The distance that had once defined their relationship had started to dissolve, and though there were still traces of his guarded nature, the openness between them was undeniable. It was a delicate dance, a slow, measured step forward, but it was progress. The tentative smiles, the shared glances, the gentle touches, all spoke of a new understanding, an unspoken promise that they would keep moving, keep learning, together. But that morning, as Amelia walked through the quiet, snow-covered streets of the town, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would challenge everything they had built in these short, precious days. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of tension that clung to the world around her. She had never been one to believe in fate, but the pull she felt in her chest was impossible to ignore. It was as though the universe was setting them up for something that would force them to confront everything they had worked so hard to overcome. She stopped outside the little bakery, where the familiar scent of fresh bread and pastries wafted through the door, a comforting contrast to the chill of the morning. But as she stood there, she caught sight of something, or rather, someone, that made her heart stutter. Liam. He was standing just across the street, his back to her, but there was no mistaking the familiar figure. For a moment, Amelia stood frozen in place, her breath catching in her throat. It had been months since she had last seen him, since he had disappeared without a word, leaving behind only the echo of their shared moments, the memories of their time together. The laughter, the warmth, the connection came rushing back with an intensity that almost knocked her breath from her lungs. Her first instinct was to turn away, to flee before he saw her, before she had to confront whatever feelings had remained in the wake of their brief but unforgettable time together. But something inside her, something deep within, told her that she couldn't run from this. She had to face it. She had to face him. Taking a steadying breath, Amelia stepped forward, her feet moving almost on their own accord. The world around her seemed to blur, the sounds of the town fading as she approached him. And as she drew closer, Liam turned, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something that spoke of unspoken words, of regret, of unfinished business. She stopped just a few feet away from him, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She hadn't expected to see him here, in this small town, in this strange moment. But there he was, standing in front of her, as real as the snow falling softly around them. "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the stillness of the morning. She didn't know what to say. The words, the questions, the emotions all felt like they were trapped inside her, tangled up in a web of uncertainty. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for something. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never meant to disappear like that. I should have explained. I should have told you the truth." Amelia's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had never been angry with him. Not truly, but seeing him now, hearing the weight in his words, stirred something in her. She wanted to ask him why, to demand an answer to the question that had lingered for so long. But instead, she found herself saying something different. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and something else, something that bordered on pain, but also hope. Liam took a slow, deliberate step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I never stopped thinking about you," he confessed, his voice soft but firm. "I never stopped feeling the way I felt when I was with you. But after everything that happened, I had to leave. I needed to understand who I was, what I wanted. And I thought that leaving would make it easier. But it didn't," Amelia said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was no anger in her tone, only a quiet understanding. She knew what it felt like to try to outrun feelings, to push them down and pretend they weren't there. But the truth always had a way of catching up, didn't it? "No," Liam said, shaking his head slowly. "It didn't. And I've been trying to find a way back ever since." The silence that fell between them was thick with unspoken words, and Amelia felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. She had never expected to see him again, never expected to be faced with this moment, this choice. But now that he was here, now that they were standing face to face once more, she realized something she hadn't fully admitted to herself. She had moved on. The realization hit her like a wave, sweeping away the lingering feelings for Liam that she had thought were still there, still burning in her heart. It wasn't that she didn't care for him. It was that she had found something else, something deeper, something real. Ethan had shown her a kind of love that was steady and true, a love built on trust and understanding. And now, standing here with Liam, she understood that her heart had already made its choice. "I'm sorry, Liam," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "But I've moved on. I'm with someone else now." The words stung, both for her and for him. Liam's face fell, the hurt evident in his eyes. But there was something else there, too. Relief, and maybe even a quiet understanding. "I see," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He took a step back, as if the space between them had suddenly become too vast to bridge. "I never wanted to hold you back, Amelia. I never thought you would be able to move on. But I'm glad you did. You deserve that. You deserve someone who can be there for you." Amelia felt the sting of unshed tears, but she held them back. She had made her choice, and it wasn't about who she had been, or who she had thought she might be. It was about who she was now, standing here in this moment, with the future stretching out before her. "Goodbye, Liam," she said softly, turning to leave, her heart both heavy and light all at once. As she walked away, the weight of the past seemed to fall away. She wasn't running anymore. She was moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the warmth of her own heart, strong and steady, guiding her toward the life she had always dreamed of. And as the snow continued to fall, she knew that the final choice had been made. The heart always knows the way. Chapter 20. Silent Snow, Hidden Hearts. Amelia stood by the window, her gaze focused on the falling snow that blanketed the world outside. The town had transformed overnight, a winter wonderland that seemed untouched, pure. The air was crisp, and everything felt quiet and still, save for the soft rustling of the trees and the distant sound of bells ringing through the streets. It was as if the universe itself had taken a deep breath, holding its secrets in the snowflakes that danced through the sky. It had been days since she had seen Liam, days since that moment in the town square when her past had collided with her present in the most unexpected way. She had walked away, and with each step, she had felt the weight of her decision settle deeper in her chest. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. And now, standing here in the warmth of the bookstore, surrounded by the familiar scents of ink and paper, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she was missing. The decision to move forward with Ethan had been one of the hardest she'd ever made. It had been a journey, one filled with uncertainty and self-discovery, but it had also been a journey towards something real. She had learned to open her heart again, to trust in the love that had slowly been blossoming between them. And now, as Christmas drew nearer, she couldn't help but wonder what the future might hold. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow, his face bright with the same warmth that had been there ever since they had started this journey together. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle but full of life. "I thought I'd find you here." Amelia smiled, her heart swelling at the sight of him. He had become her constant, the one she turned to when the world felt too heavy. They had grown together in ways she hadn't anticipated, each day bringing new understanding, new joy. She stepped toward him, her hands reaching out as though drawn by some invisible thread. "You're just in time," she said softly. "I was thinking about everything." Ethan's eyes softened, and he closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "What were you thinking about?" "About how far we've come," Amelia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much we've both grown. It's like we've been given a second chance at everything. A second chance to heal, to love, to be who we're meant to be." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding. "I've been thinking about that too. about how everything that's happened, has led us here, to this moment. It's not just about love. It's about trust and hope and being willing to open ourselves to something more than what we've known. Amelia's heart swelled at his words, and she leaned in, her forehead resting against his for a brief moment of connection. There was something profound in the silence between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. They had both been through so much, so many storms, so many misunderstandings. But here, in this moment, it felt as if they had finally found their way to calm. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want to face it with you. I want to build something with you. A future that's ours." His smile was slow, but it was the kind of smile that made her heart ache with happiness. He cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumb brushing over her cheek as though memorizing the feeling of her skin. "I want that too," he said quietly. More than anything, the world outside seemed to pause, as if holding its breath along with them. The snow continued to fall in gentle flurries, and for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt as though everything was exactly as it should be. The road ahead might not always be easy, but with Ethan by her side, she knew they could face whatever challenges life might throw their way. "I've been thinking about something else," Ethan continued, his voice taking on a lighter tone. "Something that's been on my mind for a while." Amelia looked up at him, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He grinned, a playful glint in his eyes. "Well, I've been trying to figure out how to make this Christmas the most special one yet. For both of us." Amelia's heart fluttered in her chest. She had a feeling she knew where this was going. "What do you mean?" Ethan chuckled softly and pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, neatly wrapped box tied with a ribbon. Amelia's eyes widened as she took it from him, her fingers tracing the soft edges of the paper. Her heart quickened as she met his gaze. "Ethan, what?" "Open it," he urged, his voice filled with quiet anticipation. Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon and carefully peeled away the wrapping. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, was a delicate silver necklace, its pendant shaped like a snowflake. It shimmered in the light, the tiny diamonds embedded in the design catching the glow of the room. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's a symbol," he said softly, "a symbol of everything we've been through, everything we've found in each other. The snowflake is unique, just like us. No two are the same. And just like this winter, I want to be with you through every season of life. Through the cold, through the warmth, through everything." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, and she took a shaky breath. "Ethan, I don't have words. This means everything to me." He gently took the necklace from its box and fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin with a tenderness that made her heart swell. As the cool metal rested against her chest, she realized that it wasn't just the necklace that mattered. It was the promise behind it. The promise of love, of trust, of a future they would build together. "I love you, Amelia," Ethan said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "And I'll always love you, no matter what." "I love you too," she whispered back, her heart full. "With all of my heart." And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the snow continued to fall, a soft, gentle reminder that life had a way of giving second chances, of turning even the coldest moments into something beautiful. The future, uncertain as it was, stretched out before them. But as long as they had each other, Amelia knew that they would be able to face whatever came their way, together. And so, with the world outside covered in snow, they stepped into the future, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of more beautiful chapters yet to be written.